Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. This week in the news, Susan is my co-pilot, and we're finishing off a trilogy we're doing on the future of fair admissions. And in this series by James Murphy, the senior policy analyst of educational reform. And we looked at a number of topics in the past, including early decision and legacy preferences. And this one kind of pulls everything together and looks at transparency. We'll have another question from a listener that was sent in that Lisa and I will tackle. And our interview will be part 2 of 3 with Dr. Christine Gangelhoff, looking at advice for music majors from a music specialist. And we'll continue our college spotlight as Lynda will do the final part on Loyola University Chicago. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good. So, friends, Susan and I are actually recording this a little early because we're going to be at the SACAC conference. So I'm sitting here recording this on the 17th of April, and we've got a dinner set up for the 23rd. Right. So I'll see you in 6 days.
It's just going to be wonderful to be in person. Yep, with 4 of us.
And 2 of our dedicated listeners are joining us. So we're really excited. It'll be great to see you in person.
It's just wonderful. I love the fact that we're able to connect so much remotely, but being able to touch base in person every once in a while is a real treat.
Yeah, I feel like we've seen each other more in the last couple years than the first 10 years I was here. Yep. So awesome.
We'll have to stop that. You can't keep that up.
No. Let's keep it. But listen, I one of our astute listeners sent in and pointed out the fact that something that was said that was slightly off, and Susan wants to take the opportunity to address it. So why don't you say it, Susan?
Sure. And I'm so grateful because it's a tremendous reminder that the way that one college reads applications is not generalizable to every other college. That once the Common Application went digital, colleges were able to basically choose which colleges on the master form they wanted to have show up in their reading system. And Mark, you've often explained what Slate is, and it probably is the most popular application reading platform. It's also a CRM. It's a customer management platform as well. It's really quite an extraordinary piece of technology that, hundreds and hundreds of colleges use, and it integrates with all the major application forms that are out there. So at the university that I've been reading for the last couple of years, I'm very aware that when I look at the screen, when I'm in the Slate module and I'm reading an application, some information that the student had filled out is suppressed. And that's the university's choice. So our astute listener caught the fact that I said that from my reading experience this year, the parent, the occupation was available on the reader platform, but the name of the institution where the parent earned a degree was no longer available to the reader. And truthfully, I didn't realize that was my university's choice to block that information, because our listener, who reads applications also for a university, said that in her reading experience, that information is available. So it's an interesting thing. Students don't know when they fill out the Common App. They can assume that everything on the supplement obviously is available to that university because that university created that supplement, right? So we know that goes through, but on the actual Common Application form itself, it's not as common as I probably have led people to believe, that universities are choosing which questions go on there. Now, it's interesting that at my university, on their supplement to the Common App, they ask if the student has any relatives who graduated from the institution. So they know when they're reading a sibling, a cousin, a niece or nephew, a child, a grandchild. Kids put everybody under the sun down there for the information, but we do not otherwise know where a parent went to college. We do know the parent's highest level of educational attainment, however, and I think that's important to know because universities generally are extremely sensitive to kids coming from first generation households, and also households where English may not have been their first or best language, because those applications should be treated with a different kind of respect and understanding. So that information absolutely is, but I was just thinking nobody knew where anybody's parents went to college.
No, but it's great, Susan, because our listeners are going to get 2 tips this week. And so that's one of the tips. Like, just because you complete something, different schools are getting sometimes different information because schools have the ability to pick and choose what information they suppress.
That's right.
And sometimes they can do that for various reasons. They may think it could bias a reader. They might think they can present that to their applicants with integrity. I know I have worked with parents. I can think of one in particular. Boy, was she ever hot about the fact that schools were going to see the degrees of the specific colleges and college attainment for her as a parent. She felt it was going to be used against her, in the process. And so I could see a school being proud of the fact of saying we suppress that information. But, it would be interesting for you to maybe find out what the reason is they choose to suppress it and come back and share that so that we're not speculating what it is.
I will absolutely do that. I'd also love to see, well, I guess, anyone can create a practice account with Common App. Parents can do that.
Sure.
The juniors I'm working with right now, the kids whose college process I'm helping launch in the spring of their junior year, we always create a practice Common App account because I think it's a tremendous education for the student to be able to see the information, more or less, that a college will have about them. Now, case in point, not necessarily, but most of it, right?
Right.
I suspect there were only a couple of questions, like the religion question and the parent alma mater question, that gets suppressed. But when I look at a Common App with a junior, they realize, oh wow, this is the skeleton kind of on which I now have to hang the rest of who I am. This is like the bones of the application, and I've got to start hanging the rest of who I am on this form.
Well, I'm going to transition because we have 2 tips today, and we still have our vernacular, and then the big number I think might stimulate some conversation too. So our really astute listeners will remember I did something that was a little cruel last month when I was on with Susan. I had a light bulb of inspiration that popped into my head when she was talking, and I said, I've got our tip for next month, but it was a tease like they do in TV. I said, you got to come back in a month. So you may remember Susan had been talking about how back when she was on the admission side, but it's still true to this day, you have goals, you have objectives and targets that different stakeholders are looking at, and you're always trying to get as many different schools as possible and not just recruit from the same, New England feeders or suburban feeders or whatever. And our regular listeners also know, I really like this book called Valedictorians at the Gate by Rebecca Sapke, a former admission director at Dartmouth. And she said something in her book, and, I'm always joking with Lisa because she's always quoting Evan Mandery's book, Poison Ivy. Well, all three of my points today come from this book. They're her big number, the tip, and as well as the vernacular. So shout out to that book. It's fantastic listen on it, especially as an audiobook. So one thing that Becky Sapke says in that book is when she was at Dartmouth, one thing she really appreciated was anytime a student would explain it's like a curriculum irregularity or a unique feature of the school's offerings, because you didn't always get that. That wasn't always on the profile.
That's
the
right.
School counselor may not always communicate that. So the student that took time to explain some things, she was grateful for. And so that's the tip. Like if you're at a school and they have anything that's unique that you might question whether or not somebody would be able to understand your transcript or your offerings, please take time to explain that, because admission officers appreciate that. They're trying to be fair and just and understand you and your school as much as possible. And as much as you have a system with things like secondary school reports and school counselors and profiles, it's not a perfect system, and some things can slip through the cracks. And
Absolutely.
so there is a place for that. And I'll tell you, I'm going to share this just because it literally happened to me today, Susan. I was doing a session with a student from Tennessee, and it's a pretty strong student. And it turns out that they took Latin 1 in the 8th grade, Latin 2 in the 9th grade, and didn't have another foreign language. And I was talking with them about how problematic this could be with selective schools. And then they said, well, they dropped Latin 3. It's not offered. And I said, you have got to talk about that, So that's an example. And of course, they're going to go back and change their curriculum now and make sure they at least get a language in senior year. It's not ideal, but it's better with a story. Is certainly better than stopping a foreign language at the end of 9th grade, even that you got to the second year.
Wow. Boy, that was good thing. Good catch. Good catch, Mark.
Well, we're going through their curriculum. So, but I'm sure you were nodding, Susan. I'm sure you can attest to there's times a student can actually help out a reader, and not everybody's coming from a place like where we worked, where you would be able to explain those things either through a counselor call or a profile or something. We have to assume the average kid coming from big public school.
Right.
And I've seen, one thing I require, I'm sure you do as well, Susan, for anybody you work with, I require a school profile.
Right. Absolutely.
But some of them are just pathetic.
They're terrible.
They're absolutely abysmal.
They can be terrible. They're
abysmal.
They're not
some are
written
good.
with the college admission reader in mind, and they should be, because it should be called the college profile, which is different perhaps from a profile that a high school might publish with just data that would be more for the parent community or the school board or whatever. It's really it's like a company. What are they called? Like a prospectus or when you're looking at a company that you might want to invest in, and you look at the overview and the numbers, and there's probably a more professional word.
No, that's the word for finances.
For perspective.
Yeah.
So, you want to know you want to know the mission statement. You want to know, and coming from New York City and now working with a number of New York City kids every year, the high schools are so different, even within the public school system in New York. And they don't do a wonderful job on either the transcript or on any kind of profile to talk about the nature of the school, what's special about the pedagogy, why it was founded with a different, concept, in mind. And so I always look at that and I say to the kids, gee, you've got a wonderful opportunity to bring your school to life, because it's very cool. And the readers will really benefit and understand everything better as a result.
Yeah. So our second thing, once again, from the book, our admissions vernacular, this word is the word flat. And I have heard that word used 2 different ways. I'm curious how you've heard it used in admissions, Susan. How have you heard it when used in reference to an applicant? The applicant is flat.
Well, from my experience, it means that the application is reading kind of in a very predictable, I was going to say unemotional, but I don't think that's the right way to describe it. Just a bit lifeless.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Am I on the right path there?
Yeah, yeah. Because when I did boarding school admissions, we used that word flat a lot to refer to somebody who tended to be kind of dull and boring, to be honest. That was flat. But the way Becky Sabsky used it in the book is more sparse. Well, it was partly that, but it was also more sparse. So it's someone who blows through college admissions questions without putting a lot of time into them.
Yeah.
She used another example. She used a specific example of, it's the student who said in their activity section that they participate in SCORE and they never tell me what SCORE is, So it's just an application that didn't have a lot of time and attention brought to it, so it wasn't fully filled out. So
like the bare minimum.
Yeah, bare minimum. And of course she goes on to talk about how that does not serve you well. We used it more like if somebody was uninspiring, but the two of them could somewhat converge together.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, it's more about the personality that's in the application. And, application readers, there's so much variety in an application pool. And you never want to kind of diss the kids, because whether they're excited about your college or not, and whether they're flat or whether they're sparkly or whatever the opposite is, they're paying their fee and they're doing the job, and they're hopeful on some level that you're going to consider them. But it was funny because that reminds me way back in my years at Bates, when everything was being read by hand and we wrote our notes by hand, there was a lot of shorthand that evolved, but they had to be well-known abbreviations. And Q&D was something that would, I think, equal kind of the flat term that you used, Mark. Can you guess what it stood for?
I haven't heard Q&D. When you said it, I was thinking that could have been a good admissions vernacular. They're getting two.
Well, this was a long time ago.
And maybe out of vogue. It may be a few decades ago.
Quiet and diligent.
Oh, quiet and diligent.
It basically is what recommenders would say when they had very little else to say. And we also were careful never to assume that that was a negative, meaning that it wasn't like a disguised, negative comment, but it just meant that there wasn't much else the recommender could say. So Q&D was very much a euphemism in my day there. I'm sure there are other things that are more au courant,
but that's a good one. And one thing she says in the book that flat was almost the kiss of death. Like if you got the label flat on you, especially in a under 10% admit rate pool.
No way.
Yeah. So that leads me to our big number. Another takeaway from her book. So she's from New Jersey, and she had New Jersey as part of her territory. And she says in the book, there were 500 high schools in New Jersey. I was visiting 35 of them a year. So that means 93% of schools did not get a visit.
Right.
And so that's my big number, 93%. But here's how I want to go with that. Those 7%, that's not willy-nilly. That's not picking straws. That is very, very intentional. Susan knows this. This is stuff you do research on. This is stuff you look at when you're doing your planning and you're planning your travel calendar. And schools are getting visited for a reason. Maybe you're trying to break into a new community. Maybe it's been a traditional feeder and it's giving you great kids year after year. And so I'm turning my big number into another tip, which is take it really seriously if you're getting a visit from a high school. Because one school, one person, one state, only 7% of the schools in New Jersey get a visit from Dartmouth. And so that's an opportunity for you because it really, Susan, because I used to help you with those visits in the South Room, and we'd have dinners with the students, and sometimes you'd let me do them while you ran off and did other activities.
I was so grateful, Mark.
I love doing them. You knew you could never give me enough of them. Well, I love them because, they were kind of like group interviews to me. I would see how the question students would ask. I would see how the rep would interact. I'd spend time with the rep afterward. And then sometimes they would just talk to you and they would be like, that kid with the red sweater was really impressive,
And so I try to let kids know, like, these are opportunities to come prepared, great questions, good manners, and then a follow-up, It also could be a lost opportunity too, because, Susan, we know, like, when we had someone who was interested in a school and they don't show up, they better have a note and a good reason why they had a conflict, why lacrosse practice ran late or something, because, that's a missed opportunity as well. And it sends a message not to show up when they come, especially if you're a rising senior and you have interest. And there are reasons, there are legitimate reasons. You had, it's the only time you could take the makeup exam, and there's legitimate reasons, but you're best not to just assume you had a good reason. They're going to know you had a good reason.
Right. Like, I already visited the campus.
Right.
Or my older brother goes there, or, I was there for summer for an engineering institute. I didn't need to skip a class to see the representative. And I'm like, at least you could have shown up, shake hands.
Yeah.
Say how enthusiastic you are about the college, but that you were unable to be excused from class, but you didn't want to miss the opportunity to say hello and thank them for visiting your high school.
Well, look, pretty soon people are going to be like, are you getting commission for this book or something? But I'm going to say one more thing. You know how so many times the Ivies talk about we don't look at demonstrated interest? She would talk about how I would mark down who came for demonstrated interest credit, This is an Ivy being with a moment of candor.
See, and I don't think when there's an actual addition, things like interviews and meeting the representative on the road or applying early decision, I do not put those under the heading of demonstrated interest.
Do you call it engagement or something different?
Yeah, it's a part. It becomes a part of the application.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not putting correspondence with the, email, hi, how are you? Other forms of where kids are just trying to put themselves out there, in a way and get brownie points,
mm-hmm.
As we used to call them before demonstrated interest came. There were brownie points.
Sure.
But when there's an actual engagement on a level like that, I don't consider that demonstrated interest. I consider it a part of the application.
That you should do if you want to complete the application in a full way.
And that's why I think the Ivies would say, oh, well, I met this, student at their school visit and had a conversation. It's just not like check mark. There's an actual potential addition to the application by the rep at that point.
Well, the important thing, and I think this is something we talked about a lot, is people do define demonstrated just very differently.
Oh, yeah.
And so you're not necessarily talking apples and apples when you say that term. It can mean one thing to one person. It means, do you use very sophisticated methods of predictive modeling where you're coming back with a percentage chance that someone's coming, and they say, we don't do that, so we don't use demonstrated interest.
Exactly.
But at the same time, whether or not you visited the school or you attended a virtual program may be noted as partly a sign of your engagement, or even part of whether you understand what you're getting into.
Right. And in fact, when I was listening to Ronnie Turner's interview with you, Mark, from Washington University in St. Louis, she had a completely different definition of demonstrated interest than a lot of the other folks that you've interviewed. And it stood out to me in a really big way and reminded me of that very thing that you just said, that there was a place where she made some judgments that she was almost still a little uncomfortable with, because she felt she had removed some things from the application process that personalized it.
Yeah. So if those who didn't hear that interview, that part, Susan's referring to, Renee mentioned that WashU's not using demonstrated interest anymore, and she wonders sometimes if they made a good decision or not. And I was assuming that she was talking about, well, it's so much harder to predict who's coming now and she was saying before, you got checks if you visited, and it was sort of public about that. And it was known out there in certain circles. And we removed that partly in their commitment to access because we realized we were privileging the privilege.
Right.
But now what she was saying was, it's so important to visit our school to really get who we are. And now are we
that's a good point.
Yeah. So are we discouraging some visitors now who don't get the full picture, and they would have been better off getting the full picture? So Sorry for this profession to be so confusing. It's hard enough as it is, and then terms get used differently. But you're listening to this and plugging into sources like this so that you can be, part of the educated group that can help your student and give them all the opportunities they can. But Susan, you and I know we can talk about anything and everything, and I'll see you in a few days in Jacksonville, Florida, where we can pick up. But
and now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
We're going to transition to the third part of a series, and we've already done part 1 and part 2, where we're looking at something Educational Reform Now did, a report series by James Murphy called The Future of Fair Admissions. And Susan and I, probably about a half a year ago, talked about early decision. And then I think it was just our last month, Susan, we looked at part 2, which was legacy admissions. And then this is part 3, which looks at transparency. And so I'm going to try to keep my comments fairly brief on this, and then you can take it where you want to go. So this one felt almost like a summary of all of them. Like all of them are looking at the fact that colleges and universities should be engines of social mobility. So what impediments are in place from a socioeconomic standpoint and a racial standpoint that are tilting the deck so that it's not fair? And they're working off of the assumption that it looks like affirmative action is probably going to be overruled. And then how are institutions going to be even more skewed racially, socioeconomically, and well-resourced, less resourced, and other forms of difference, and what can be done about it? And so this is a call for transparency, and it's something actually that Susan mentioned in the first one. This is a call to report data in a way that disaggregates the data for admitted applicants, because right now a lot of the data is not disaggregated. And it's basically saying, don't just take my word for it. If we're going to go in this direction, then we need to be able to track the data. So here's a quote. This is from the summary statement of the article. It says, IPED's admission survey component should ask universities and colleges that already report data for entering first-time degree certificate-seeking students in the fall term to report the total number for applicants, admits, and enrollments. And then it says, as they currently do. But this is the key point. But they also should be reporting the numbers for applicants, admits, and enrollments disaggregated by categories of race, ethnicity, and gender. And then it also goes on to say, and probably socioeconomic status, so that we can really see how much things like early decision and legacy are privileging the privileged. In other words, I have very strong reason to believe that's true, but don't necessarily listen to me. Let's look at the data and let the data speak for itself. And Susan, you mentioned that back in one of our past conversations, that the data needs to be disaggregated. And so that's really what it's a call for. It's a call for transparency and disaggregating the data. The article goes on to talk about how this would benefit a lot of people. So it says that if the proposed changes to IPEDS would benefit a range of stakeholders, it would help policymakers. It says it would help policy advocates. It would help researchers. It would help civil rights organizations. It would help institutions for higher ed. It would help school counselors. It would help students. It would help state, tribal, and federal agencies, such as the Institute of Educational Sciences and the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. And so it lists all the people that would benefit if this data would be disaggregated. It goes on to make a point like things can change. Legacy information wasn't being even added at all into the admissions questionnaire that's filled out. But in the fall of 2022, legacy did get added as a question. Now it does go on to say there are no questions about how many applicants, admits, or enrollments have legacy status. So there's still a lot of room for improvement there. But the point is, they can change. They don't have to do things the way they've always done. And it would benefit all of us to actually look at real data and and see how things like legacy and early decision are really impacting schools. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds and do too long of a preamble, but take it wherever you want to go with it.
Well, for our listeners who are real data fiends out there, like I know you are, Mark, I really encourage parents to look at this trilogy of articles by James Murphy if they're really interested in it. It does represent a fairly out there opinion. This last article of the three, as you said, it's really a summary of all three issues, because there's actually a lot less to say about disaggregating data.
Right. Yeah, you can't get 13 pages off that without repeating some things. Most of them about 13 pages. Yeah.
And a lot of people read this report and go, well, what would I do if I knew what the disaggregated data was? How would I make sense of it? Whereas the others are such emotionally packed issues and are of greater general interest. But for parents who love data and want to get into this, it does give a really deep look at the levels of accountability that colleges have and what they don't have. I came away from this one. There's no downside to reporting disaggregated data. And that just means for everything that they report, they ought to be reporting more of it at various stages in the application pipeline. I mean, I think it is important, for students of color, especially if indeed colleges have to move to another way of identifying underrepresented students in the admission process in order to continue their commitment to diversity. We need to be able to track that. And I think the reason why we know so much of what went on in California is because they turned it into a state law that the disaggregated data had to be tracked and reported. So the reason why we know in this article the information about the decline of applicants, admitted students, and enrolling students of color in the public universities in California is because they got that data, and they've had to report it. And of course, it points out what a shame the loss of affirmative action was. But when lawmakers make decisions, we've got to find out what the repercussions are. We do. And if we said to the Supreme Court today, so is your intent, is your desire as the Supreme Court that we have fewer underrepresented people of color in higher ed, and climbing the social mobility ladder so that they are higher income earners in professional, making contributions at professional levels? Is that your intention? That there be less of that? I'm sure they'd say no. Right? I'm sure they'd say absolutely not. So I mean, I think that's the question we're all going to be asking ourselves. But we're only going to know if, like in California, we have the numbers moving forward over the years. It'll be interesting.
Susan, I'm not sure if they would say no. I think that they might say it's a meritocracy. And I don't think my sense is there's not always the understanding of how much advantage some people have and how much disadvantage other people have. I think that we don't teach history well in this country. We don't like to grapple with some of these real prickly issues that, especially in this political climate, that involve things like race and class and gender, and really looking at various forms of injustice and discrimination and advantage and disadvantage. I think those things are things that can make people very uncomfortable, because when you come to terms with your own privilege, then sometimes you might feel compelled to have to do something that might not feel good, or just it maybe you like to think you're the self-made person and you've, sort of accomplished everything your own. And then you come to realize all the advantage you had. Yeah, that's not something everyone's comfortable with, looking in the mirror and saying, oh, maybe I don't look as good as I thought I did. I could be wrong, but that's my sense, is not everybody is interested. And I know that history is not taught in a way that people understand affirmative action in the same way that educators do. And
Yeah.
I think part of that is because there's not a knowledge, not as much of an understanding of just how many obstacles certain groups have had historically. You know, the thing that always gets so tricky with then when you introduce the class piece, it just becomes so much more complicated.
Yes.
It's a lot easier when it's just, if it's strictly class, it's a lot easier for people to embrace. It's race and class, and then you get into middle class, and then it gets a lot trickier. You know, another thing that the article brought out was the holistic admission process is already so confusing and so opaque that one thing about disaggregated data is it would shed more of a light on things, and that parents would probably appreciate that. But I also know, and I think every one of these articles I've appreciated, they have research. I appreciate the passion for a more just society. I do feel there's been some point in every one of the articles where I felt some of the things felt a little simplistic and naive also.
Yeah, I agree.
And while I'd love to see more disaggregated data on race, ethnicity, and gender, and social class and legacy, I can also see the backlash. All of a sudden, when you saw numbers for certain places, I don't know if that leads to lawsuits or certainly substantial accusation and phones ringing and things. And maybe somebody would argue that it should ring, but there could also lead to misinterpretation of data without context.
Absolutely.
And that can be really dangerous.
That was a huge takeaway for me too, Mark. The lack of equality at kind of the starting line, whether you're talking about kids coming from, very unequal school settings or unequal opportunity, or you talk about colleges that have very unequal opportunities to recruit and attract diverse students from diverse backgrounds. I would worry, going back to my first admissions job where I worked for a small liberal arts college in Maine, it was almost virtually impossible to attract African-American students and Hispanic students. There was not a local population in the state. There was hardly any representation on the faculty. Now we're going back decades here.
Sure,
Things
sure.
have changed, but that there were so many things that were an impediment. The willingness was there. We put the recruiting dollars into it, but it took literally decades to build a critical mass of people of color on the faculty, so that as kids visited, they saw people who looked like them and might have come from, a background that was, understanding. It took years of developing partnerships, because me going into high schools in my recruiting territory, I was responsible for the whole state of Connecticut, very proud, and Metro New York. Those were my primary territories. And I made a big point of not just recruiting at the prep schools that were the feeder schools, even though I respected them and I had to keep them happy. I really wanted to get in and talk with kids who would never in a million years have considered this option, because we were going to give them the financial aid. We were going to make it happen for them. If they were strong enough to get in, we would make it happen for them financially. And I think that's still what so many schools are doing now but the outreach had to take a long, long time. And we had to have partnerships like you've described, in recent episodes with community-based organizations and nonprofit organizations that are doing a lot of the groundwork with students to get them to be more open-minded about geography and setting, because the non-urban colleges are the ones that are falling all over themselves to attract every kind of diversity, every kind of underrepresented student in the book. But it's a tough battle, and I would never want those schools to be judged by low numbers because they're not a natural magnet. They're not a Temple University or NYU or BU or, a place where it's a more logical And here I am with my East Coast myopia when I say that. But I think you know what I mean is
Sure.
the data could all be weaponized,
and it could even be weaponized in the opposite direction, because just to affirm what you're saying, Susan, you and I worked with all kinds of students in our years together at Westtown, all races, all ethnicities, all income levels. But I know initially we started out working with a lot of the students of color that I had recruited, and I would see on the college side, like they would have a much, much better chance at going to a place that was in the hinterlands that didn't have a natural diverse pool of students around them. The Bateses, the Colbys, the Grinnells, the Middleberries. You couldn't take a look at schools like that and look at their acceptance rate and transfer it over to another more urban school like, Penn or different places and think, oh, there's probably a similar chance. They were very, very different. Because as we've said, schools want what they don't have. And so they valued that. And so another way it could even be weaponized, if you're reporting all that data, is some of those schools would have higher admit rates for these populations. And then somebody could push back on them for that too. Why are you accepting, such percent? In fact, there was a journal I used to subscribe to called Journal of Blacks in Higher Education.
Yes, sure.
Remember that? I
do.
They're still around, but they got rid of like a lot of things. They got rid of their print edition, and now it's just, email subscription only. But they always would profile 25 most selective. They used U.S. News, unfortunately, but that's a lot of people use that. 25 top rated liberal arts and national universities for a lot of their reports. And they used to report the admit rates for Black students, and then most of the schools started saying NA, and they started, because you just know there was some blowback that came from that in some way. So you could either be accused of why are your numbers so low, or why is your admit rate higher? In a lot of ways, it could be weaponized.
Well, and I could certainly see that if colleges went public for all these populations that they favor, because what the public consistently loses sight of is that this is not a way that unqualified students get into colleges. I dare say that is hardly ever. In fact, we mentioned it, I think, in the last episode I was on, that it's a disaster for everybody if an unqualified student is admitted, unless a university college has the proper supports in place. Athletes are classic. The classic example there of that, when athletics are a tremendous influence, as well as other talents, but we all know about athletics. But the level of academic support for these almost professional quality athletes who basically are working for the college, right, earning them a lot of money, that you just can't admit people and say, oh, we want more people like you, so we're going to admit you, even though you don't have the qualifications or the academic background to do. So you have to always say, on the college side, the student first has to cross that threshold of admissibility where we know they can do the work. After that, that's when you build the class. Right, that's where you start putting the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together for your freshman class, so that it has the representation that the strategic plan has called for. But that those numbers would not represent that, right?
Yeah, and I think there's, I'm going to say something that's controversial, but I've never shied away from it. Different aspects of white supremacy inundates our ideology. It's like in the air. And it's sometimes hard for people to look at a person of color and see them as their equal. It's not necessarily a conscious thing. It's just all the images that you've been fed over years and years and years. And that's one of the reasons why there's such a visceral reaction toward race-based affirmative action that there isn't toward legacy or athletes. In my opinion, I'm going to speak for myself. I'm not going to speak for the entire Your College Bound Kid crew here. We have 7 co-hosts, and they're all entitled to their own views and their own opinions. But that's something, is, as a person of color, you grew up saying that you have to be, you have to be superior to be considered competent. Like, there's a lot of deep seated stereotypes with how people see things when it comes to being intellectually competent. And so that's my personal belief. I feel very strongly about it, why there's so much emotional energy around the topic of race when it comes to diversity that isn't there for gender, isn't there for social class, isn't there for athletes, or even for legacy, or even for donors. You could argue there should be as much passion against all of these preferences, but race is like a low-hanging fruit, and it's easy to gin up a lot of emotion there. And I think it has to do with a lot of times people looking and saying, I have a hard time believing that person took my spot. And so so it does speak to people not necessarily seeing people as being equal. So I don't think you can say that. And I'm not talking about everybody. I'm not talking about even conscious emotions that people even want to think. I think one of the I'm getting really probably more philosophical here than we normally do. But for those who followed the 5 Black cops that brutalized the Black person in Memphis, there was a lot of talk like, how could that have been about race?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a lot of conditioning that even impacts how Black people see Black people. I remember a meeting in Texas when I lived there, and a guy saying to me, Black people have the same stereotypes of Black people that white people have. They just say, I'm not that person. So it kind of has to do with how do stereotypes get in your mind? You don't one day wake up and say, I want to have stereotypes.
Right.
If when you turn on TV and the crime that you see is from a certain particular people, or you drive through a neighborhood and that's what you see, all those things condition your mind. If all the examples that you see of judges, professors, or people in highly elevated positions are not Black people, then it doesn't necessarily compute. Now, it's way better now. Look at TV compared to how it was 30, 40, 50 years ago in terms of positive role models and images. But those are how stereotypes get formed, right? Like stereotypes don't start out most of the time with someone saying, I want to have a negative view of this particular group of people, so I'm going to consciously train my mind to do that. It's based on thousands of different images that are fed into your mind over time. And if they're not fed through the lens of history and understanding things. So I've never gone so far off into a range of different things here, Susan. And I'm sure that there'll be some listeners who won't like this conversation, but I'm trying to just be authentic.
And it supports the concerns that you and I share about data that could actually backfire and be turned against the very principles that well-meaning educators are hoping that data would be used for. And it's funny because the other piece of this article that kind of rankled with me was the assumption basically that Murphy makes that all institutions of higher ed have social mobility as their primary goal and sense of calling. And well, that wasn't why they were founded, that's for sure. Some, yes, but no, actually quite, au contraire, they were founded to, cement the social class system, as we know, and we've talked about before. But, that would be not the first number one on the mission statement for a lot of schools. I think it's implied, but I don't know if all higher ed schools have really unpacked that.
I think it's an important point you're bringing out, because he sort of starts with an assumption that that's just the way it is and it's the way it should be.
Right.
And that's a certain, that's a liberal progressive view. That's a liberal progressive view that, and I share a lot of that, but that doesn't mean every institution needs to have that as its mission or have it as its priority, that they're trying to be an engine of social mobility and move everybody I mean, I think a lot of institutions value that, but you're right. It's not necessarily priority 1, 2, or 3.
But I think his other point that if a institution is getting money from the federal government
that's a good
to
point.
accomplish whatever it is, whether it's financial aid or research money, whatever, then that's a must. And in a way, I would love to have seen him take it from, back it up and say, maybe that's the beginning point for a lot of schools right now. If we lose the influence of race in college admissions, that we revisit that institution by institution and talk about not just, well, how are we going to do an end run around, the end of affirmative action and get what we want, but where are we coming from on this, and strategically, what does it mean to us and to the future of our institution?
It's going to be really interesting to see, Susan, because you've got two competing forces. You've got the law, which you need to adhere to.
Right.
And I'm sure there's going to be even more watchdogs now, assuming affirmative action is overturned, making sure institutions comply. And then you've got your general counsel and your compliance office, all that. But then you also have schools who, at their core, believe that a diverse learning environment is the best preparation for society. Their employers are telling them they want that.
Right.
And they also, let's face it, there's a certain amount of institutional resistance with Big Brother telling you how to run your institution and what's the best way to educate your population from non-educators. So there's some inherent resistance there, and a strong belief that we would be providing an inferior service if we don't have a diverse applicant pool. And so how those two come together, because those are going to be competing forces.
That's right. Yeah, I know.
One positive is that it should, unleash a lot of creativity. Now, we've seen a certain amount of creativity from the 9 states, and now recently Idaho, the 10th state, that have outlawed affirmative action on state basis, going all the way back to California in 96. And, we now have almost 30 years of schools trying different things, Michigan and Texas and Washington and, different states. It's going to unleash even a lot more creativity. But a lot of it, as I talk to people, it's going to depend on the severity of the ruling, too.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the schools I visited this summer said that they aren't able to meet full need, but they do it for their underrepresented students because they wouldn't really have many if they didn't do it there. And now are they not going to be able to do that and have even less? They're already not that diverse. So there's a lot of another one told me, what about the scholarship that was given over 50 years ago, endowed
right,
for a Black student, and the donor's not even alive anymore? Are we going to have to track down who's ever in charge and get them to change the language? I mean, there's a lot of things we don't have answers for yet. And whenever the decision comes down, it's probably going to be an earthquake, even that people are doing their best to prepare for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because people are going to have to immediately figure out, like, what does this mean for me? And I have a feeling it's still going to be opaque.
I agree. I don't think it's going to be, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. I don't think they're going to get into the weeds. But, everybody, a lot of colleges have already experienced this with religious discrimination, where there were scholarships and admissions priorities that were religiously oriented. I know the college I worked for there was endowed scholarships for non-Catholics. Literally, it was so anybody but a Catholic, that kind of thing where families were trying to do the right thing when they established these endowments in favor of people who were less privileged, perhaps. But so there is some experience there with how endowed programmatic funds have to change. I think a lot of colleges, as I've seen, like the fly-ins and the race-based programming, have already
started to morph a little bit.
Oh yeah, they've shifted to socioeconomic status, first generation college status. So I think people are getting ready. It's still going to be an earthquake, as as you say.
Well, another place you saw it, the titles that people, multicultural recruiter, director announce, all these other things, institution and access and equity and very like non-race-based language tied into people's titles as well, which you see. So Susan, what should our takeaways be for our listeners off this one?
Well, to take it to a really simple place, because I know that a lot of this data is complicated and everyone's going to be interested, I think the public at large, as to what's going to happen with legacy and early decision. I don't think early decision is going to be going away. Legacy could potentially, if race goes away, legacy may go away. Although, again, I think there's a big misperception out there that legacy preference means it's the only reason why a student was admitted. And that has never in my long career been my experience. I think it is one of those things that has been an influence. As my dean at Bates once said to me, this is not a game of feet, this is a game of inches. And now it's a game of, millimeters, right? Little things add up. And there's hardly ever in this big world of admissions one reason why kids get in, or why they don't. And to me, the takeaway is every applicant has to write their most authentic, most honest application, be loud and proud about who they are, whatever that is, and infuse their application with their sense of understanding themselves and who they are in the world and who they want to be in the world. And I think whatever happens with these different kind of external definitions and forces, where the rubber really meets the road is when the student sits down and represents themselves to the colleges that they're interested in and looks for the match, looks for the college that will value them and where there's an alignment of values and beliefs. And I hope we don't lose that as higher ed moves forward. I think higher ed does need to be responsible for uplifting people who have not had advantages. I think it's ridiculous to assume that without that, the system's going to work and our society will be better in some way. I don't, you and I don't believe that. But if you love data and you want to read, there's some good things out there. And I think James Murphy has been provocative, and he's a little bit on one side, but I'm glad he's asking these hard questions and putting these things out there.
Yeah, no, it's food for thought. And I think it's important to read different perspectives and hear all sides. And, I think he's done good work. I would sometimes challenge a little bit of the practicality of what he's advocated for. I think it could create a lot of problems in ways that are maybe unforeseen. But I think he also has a lot of really good things to say. And so, I think it's important that we don't just read everything that is completely in alignment with what we already believe. Like, that's not how you think and grow,
that's right.
As a person. And so, we'll be back to both of these topics. We'll be back to the topic of legacy again, because we know there's going to be changes. I'm certainly anticipating more schools. In fact, one article that came out that's fascinating is in the Daily Pennsylvania, the school newspaper. Some reporters did some research on how the wording has changed for Penn regarding legacies. Oh, Susan, you sent me that article. You sent me that, and several people did, but you were one of the ones, so you know what article I'm talking about. So it's really fascinating. Like, you have schools like Hopkins and Amherst that were loud and proud when they walked away from legacy. And then you have places like Penn that are doing it very, very, very subtly. And then obviously the affirmative action is going to lead to whatever's decided. We'll have to come back and talk about the ramifications and all that. So just thank you guys so much for tuning in and all the encouraging emails you send. it really is those emails and those comments that fire us up, our whole team. That's what motivates us. We're all educators that just want to make a difference. And when we see that that's happening, it inspires us to keep trying to improve and come back and keep on keeping on. So I just want to thank all of our listeners just for being so dedicated. We have so many listeners, Susan, that never miss an episode. Had one
That's wonderful.
One that sent in shared it with you, a message this week that said, "I wish you guys were daily."
Oh, that's awesome.
So thank you guys for being such awesome listeners. And Susan, I'll see you at the conference.
That's right. I'm looking forward to it, Mark.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
So we've had a question come in that is a follow-up on the legacy discussion that we've had.
Have you read the fair admissions bill submitted to Congress by Jamaal Bowman? It does ban legacy admissions, except for one minority group. You should look at it and comment on it on your podcast.
Yeah, and I was actually happy that this question was submitted. Another anonymous, and that's okay. If you rather not leave your name, that's okay. We'll take a Speakpipe question any way you want to send it to us. And so what the listener is referring to is something that happened actually pretty recently, and we're talking February of this year. And it's legislation that's proposed by Jamaal Bowman, who's a Democrat from New York, in the House, and Jeff Merkley, who's also Democrat from the state of Oregon. And it's an attempt to address what they say is unfair and inequitable admissions processes that disproportionately benefit wealthy, white, and connected students. So what they've introduced is legislation called Fair College Admissions for Students Act. And what this would do is it would amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to bar institutions from receiving federal aid from giving any preference to applicants with legacy or donor status. And basically it's an attempt to level the playing field. So, here's a quote. All students deserve an equitable opportunity to gain admissions to institutions of higher ed, but students whose parents didn't attend or donate to a university are often overlooked in the admission process due to the historically classist and racist legacy and donor admissions practices at many schools in the country. And that's a statement that was made by Bowman. And then Merkley, the co-sponsor, here's a statement from him. Children of donors and alumni may be excellent students and well qualified, but the last people who need extra help in the complicated and competitive college admissions process are those who start with the advantages of family education and money. So the bill, of course, would allow the education secretary to waive legacy preference and ban it for institutions. However, they do have a carve out, and that would be for historically black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, minority serving institutions, otherwise known as MSIs, which they say admit high levels of underrepresented students already. And it goes, and then there's some stats, and we've talked about this a lot. One study found that legacy is worth 160 points for children of alumni, according to Princeton researchers found. The Century Foundation did a study, found that 3/4 of the nation's top 100 national universities employ legacy, and nearly almost all of the liberal arts schools, with few exceptions that we've talked about, like Johns Hopkins and Amherst and Pomona, Caltech, MIT being a few of the exceptions. And Colorado, we've talked about this before, the first state to ban legacy admissions at public colleges. So this is my thought on this. A couple thoughts, Lisa. One is, there is no doubt that legacy is about to come under fire like nothing else as soon as affirmative action is changed. And you see it, like people are already getting ahead of the curve, putting legislation that comes forward. I'm a little conflicted on it. You've probably heard me. I almost feel like I've thought out loud on this podcast my view on legacy admissions, because, my more recent position has been, if you've someone that's been actively involved in helping the school as opposed to just a box checker, I feel that should count for something. But when I see Harvard with 15,000 alumni, the other side is, well, wait a minute. Like, you literally could gobble up all your spots with that. So I'm still torn. I think that my view would be more like if you limited it to a modest percent, like 10% or something, I would feel comfortable with it. But I'm increasingly being persuaded, as Susan said in our last conversation, I think it's kind of all or nothing. Once you start getting into it's okay in this case and not that case, I think you're in for a lot of trouble. And I think there's a lot of value to that argument as well. I don't like making an exception for HBCUs, MSIs, HSIs. And it's not because I'm not supportive of them. I just think that you get really complicated when you start doing carve-outs for this institution, not those institutions. Like the people that graduated from the Hamptons and the NCATs and the Howards, I could also argue that they also have class privileges over the first-gen student applying to those schools. And so to me, for the same reason you wouldn't have a legacy preference for all schools, to me, that really would apply to your minority serving institution, your Hispanic serving institutions, and your HBCUs. So I really don't like that aspect of the legislation. I also think it's harder to get broad-based support if you start having carve-outs. I think it's easier to get support if you sort of have it. If it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be. That's the way it's going to be for everybody. But I think that the main point I want to make with this and taking this on is the momentum that is going to be behind the anti-legacy movement as soon as affirmative action is changed. It's already starting. It's already starting with legislation. And literally look at all the states. Look at those 10 states that have banned race-based affirmative action and look what they did with the legacy almost immediately.
Right.
So, and you have any thoughts? What are your thoughts on the legislation?
I mean, I think that makes sense to what you're saying to me. I think if you said, oh, you can only reserve legacy admissions for, let's say, 10%, then it's just going to make an arms race. Then we're going to be privileged and the uber rich even more, right? Because they can give whatever it takes to get that top 10%. So I do think it's more of an all or nothing kind of thing. I can certainly understand with schools why they would want to, have that because it provides them with more financial support at the end of the day, right? It's all about them as an institution continuing on.
I think it's three things. It's financial support. It's predicting yield, more likely to come. And it's sort of like true believers. It's people who kind of get the culture and get who you are. And boy, at private schools, that would feel like a lot to give up. However, we always talk about the concept of opportunity cost. Like, who is not in your student body because of that commitment to legacy that could help? This one is really going to be fascinating to me, Lisa, because when you start talking about going after legacy, you're talking about the most powerful people in the constituency. And boy, schools are not going to want to give that up. Like, for any of those three reasons: financial, yield, and continuation of culture. And then you put all the three of them together. But I just think the momentum is going to be so overwhelming that I think you're going to look like you don't believe in access when everybody, I'm not going to say everybody, but when, let's say, your overlaps in large swaths of the American higher education system start going in that direction, whether it's court mandated or it's voluntary disarmament.
Right.
But I think just the fact that this legislation is already being put into place as opposed to waiting and seeing, that shows the level of groundswell I think that's already out there a little bit, and it's just going to take off.
All right. Well, we'll see if you're right.
See if we're right. See if you're right. But thank you, Anonymous, for sending this in, and you asked us to address it, and hopefully this was helpful.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, hopefully you got to hear the first part of Lisa's interview with Dr. Christine Gangelhoff, an expert when it comes to music programs. And in part two, Christine continues talking about the important things students need to think about when selecting a program. She talks about how important the studio teacher is when selecting a school. She talks about the value of the studio lesson that a student can have, or even the virtual student lesson in the process. Christine talks about the best time for a student to get this lesson. She talks about how students can get a certificate to specialize in repairing instruments. Christine also talks about how competitive various programs are. She talks about what criteria are used to evaluate a student when they are applying. She talks about how many schools should a student apply to. And she talks about how students should prepare for auditions and pre-screens. Listen and enjoy.
So those are all some of the things to consider. And then one of the most important things, especially for a performance or composition student, is the studio teacher. And that is one of the most important things because this is a one-on-one relationship that you're going to have for 4 years. And if that's not a good fit, then you're in trouble. Actually, both people are in trouble.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And so, so that I can't emphasize enough. And so with that, anytime I have a student who's in performance or composition, one of the things that they have to do is part of the application process is they need to reach out to this potential teacher and start a dialogue with them. So they need to establish a connection, just like you would with an admissions office. You want to put yourself on a map. And with a studio teacher, so the best possibility is to get a trial lesson with them. So ideally in person. Yeah, it's just a great thing to do. And if you can't travel to the school, most of them offer a virtual lesson.
Huh. So when would a student do that? Like what, junior year, sophomore year? When would they start creating these relationships?
I would say I usually encourage it during the junior year, but like in the spring, because you kind of want to wait until auditions have passed. So
right.
Like auditions are generally, they can be January, February. So I'd say March, April, sometime in that time frame to kind of start reaching out and to just establish a connection. And then the trial lessons can be in the summer, they can be in the fall of your senior year. I mean, it's pretty, and it also depends on when you schedule your college visits. You'd want it to coincide with that. And so some teachers will offer a free trial lesson. It could be 15 minutes, a half an hour. Rarely it's a full hour. Some of them charge for it. But students who can't afford it, they can tell the teacher, could you offer a discount? Or, another possibility is just to say, oh, I can't afford a lesson, but could we just have a conversation? And so just a conversation, because you can get to know somebody. You can see, if they're willing, and if they're not willing to schedule that, then maybe that's not the teacher for you, because, you want somebody who's going to be empathetic and, willing to take the time to meet with you. And so that's really important. And then sometimes you can tell if you take a lesson, like I've had students take a lesson with a teacher, and then the teacher says, okay, you don't need to take the pre-screen. You're immediately admitted to the main audition. So just by making that effort of having that trial lesson, you've bypassed an entire step of the process. So there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah. And just being on the ground, seeing how that person teaches, what their style is, what's important to them. I mean, that's invaluable.
It really is.
Information for kids. Wow. So basically, not that many people are really appropriate candidates for a standalone conservatory, is what you're telling me. Most music students might do better in, maybe a conservatory that's also, in a university, or in a university with a really strong music program.
Yeah, I mean, there are many conservatories. People are most familiar with Juilliard, Curtis, Colburn, but there are many. They're always full. There's no shortage. But the thing is, a lot of those are preparing orchestral musicians. That's the bulk of what they do. And jazz musicians in some cases when they have jazz programs. And those are very high level. And if you look at the number of orchestral openings, it's very few. And so it's not that, I would say that it's a very small percentage that would not only get accepted, but that would thrive in that setting. Because it's one thing, it's just like when a student is obsessed with going to an Ivy League school, and even if they would get in there, the culture and the competition, it can just squash them. And, it's sometimes it's not necessarily the talent, it's the personality. And, so and you kind of know it when you see it, like, if that's a pathway for a student. And it's not that common. Like, it has to be a really, really, really focused student, but they are certainly out there. And there's some really, and the thing is, the level has increased so much over the years. Like, the competition has increased so much. Like, students are getting it kind of parallel with college admissions in general, of these students who have, a 4.0 GPA and like a million extracurriculars and all these AP, and then they get all these denies. And it's just, it parallels that. It's like these students who have these insane talents, they're not getting into these schools. And so the competition is just really fierce. So it's just really important to keep an open mind and really consider a lot of programs. And it's also like, you don't know what you don't know, because these students, I want to play in an orchestra. Like, that was what I thought when I was in high school, because I was obsessed with the Minnesota Orchestra. And I was like, I'm going to play in an orchestra. But then I quickly realized, like, that really wasn't the end all for me. And I ended up playing in orchestras. Like, I did sub many times for years in the Minnesota Orchestra, which was always like my dream. And I love it, but I discovered so many things that I didn't know existed. And so that's why I'm just cautious with students, of like, really, like, I really have them explore a lot of opportunities. And I think I shared with you this story of a student that I had that had this skill for repairing instruments. And she took a flute, and one of the pads had come off, and she took off a pencil eraser and shaved it with a razor blade and glued it on there. So it was like the exact height. And I was like, how did you know how to do that? And she said, oh, I just love repairing instruments. And I said, would you be interested in studying that? And she said, that's a thing. And she was so excited because she had no idea that was like a real life thing you could do.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so she went to a great repair school and got a degree in it, a certificate. And that's what she's doing. As a part-time job, she's doing that as well as teaching. And so there's just so many stories of that, of like a student, like a light bulb going, that exists. And yeah.
Yeah.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
This is Lynda, and this week's recommended resource is the website Greek Rank. It's a comprehensive resource for college students interested in joining Greek life. It provides information about fraternities and sororities across the country, including rankings, reviews, and ratings from current members and alumni. A key feature of Greek Rank is the ability to search for detailed information on specific fraternities or sororities. This could include a particular chapter's history, philanthropy, leadership, or events. It also allows students to see the overall ranking within their university, as well as rankings in categories such as academics and social life. Greek Rank also has a platform for members and alumni to share their experiences and opinions about their chapters, providing insight for prospective members. Students can read reviews and get a sense of each chapter's community, culture, and values. You can get started on your research of college Greek life at GreekRank.com.
Now, you bring out like that some of these programs are incredibly competitive too. How do you evaluate the selectivity of different music programs?
Yeah, I sometimes will use, when I'm talking about this in a presentation, I'll use the image of a Rubik's Cube to show, it's like, if you can solve this.
Oh God.
Yeah.
I would fail.
Yeah, me too. And it's so complicated because you can't. So first of all, if it's a program within a university, almost always the student has to meet the entry requirements of a university. So if there's a minimum testing requirement or, suggested range, they should be within that, and GPA and, all of that criteria. And then they have to meet the requirements for the School of Music. And that can be many things. It can be, usually the audition is the most important thing. As I mentioned, a lot of them will have a pre-screen requirements, the larger programs, that will kind of filter out who's a viable candidate for the in-person audition. And then there's also requirements in music theory is another thing. That's not really a deal breaker, but it is like, I definitely work with students on their music theory chops to make sure, they're set up for that. And then one of the biggest pieces of puzzle is actually the studio that the student is going into. And that varies year to year. So you can't even say selectivity is like this certain percentage because it changes every year. So for example, like in a clarinet studio, if there's typically 8 openings in a given studio, and for some reason, 4 of those students took an extra year to graduate, that next year, there's only 4 openings. So it's like half the amount. And so you don't really know. I mean, you have to do a lot of investigative work to kind of find what are your odds. And then also like the trial lesson is a really good thing because a teacher can give feedback. And, usually they can, like I gave the example of the student that was passed to bypassed the pre-screen. So that's a really good sign. Okay, I'm a viable candidate for this program. If that didn't happen and the teacher said, okay, go ahead and register for the pre-screen, that's totally, I mean, that doesn't mean like you're not a good candidate. That teacher may not do that for anyone. So you don't really have any way of knowing. But you can also ask the teacher, like, do you think this could be a good fit? Like, I'm really interested in this program, and just come right out and ask them what they, if they think. And for the most part, I mean, they're not going to say like, don't go elsewhere. They're not going to be mean or anything about it. but they can give some pretty subtle feedback that can guide you. So yeah, it's very much a puzzle, and it's really hard to figure that out. That's why it's really important to have that balanced list, because there's almost no such thing as a safety school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How many schools do you see your students applying to when they are trying to get into these different studios and, want to kind of go to a reasonably competitive program?
So I usually have them start out with about 20 of just doing in the research stage and looking at all of these, taking notes and kind of looking at the requirements for the school, the audition requirements, all of that kind of stuff. And then slowly narrowing it down. And I don't like to work with more than 10, 12 at the most, because after that, it's just too much, and it's too stressful for the students, and all of they have to write those same essays that, all students have to write. They have to prepare pre-screens. Sometimes the audition requirements can be separate repertoire from the pre-screens. So they have to learn so much music, and it's just so stressful coordinating all of that. And so I usually don't want more than 10 to 12 because it's just too much work.
No, you're right. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how students should prepare for and organize for auditions and pre-screens.
Yeah. So for that, organize is the very key. Like, you have to be incredibly organized. And I worked with one student who I use kind of my own spreadsheet system. And So I shared a spreadsheet with this student, and he said, "Oh, okay, I'll look at it." But he said, "But I thrive in chaos." And I was like, "Oh,
I don't."
I know. So I was like, oh, "Okay, this is going to be interesting." So the most important thing is to really, when you're going, so for example, going through that exercise of, let's say, 20 schools, of having like first extracting all the information onto these spreadsheets onto different tabs. So you can put like one tab would be the calendar of all the deadlines. So deadlines of, for example, if you want early action, if they offer it, some programs do. And regular decision, some music programs, their application would be due at the same time. Some of them have a different deadline. Deadline for the pre-screens, deadline for the audition, or basically like they'll have several audition dates to choose from. So I often have students do a spreadsheet that maps all of the possibilities, and then they have to like kind of compare the different options at each school to kind of, and where the school is located, to figure out how that can all work. And then also like on another tab would be the audition repertoire. And because some can just say 3 contrasting pieces or 2 contrasting pieces and an etude, and just be pretty open. But then some will say a Mozart concerto and a Bach sonata. Like they'll give specific things, or they'll say a 20th century piece or a piece by a composer from an underrepresented group. And so basically you have to map that out too and see where there's overlap. And it's a lot like how you compare essay prompts and see, okay, where can I reuse this material? You do the same thing with your audition repertoire. So those programs that give you just kind of free range of what you want to perform, you're going to be playing Mozart if somebody else requires that, because you're not going to learn an additional piece that you don't have to. So it's very strategic how you have to approach it.
Wow. Yeah, no, it really does sound like a Rubik's Cube. And I think it must be so much work. I mean, and these are, kids who are in their, late junior year, early senior year, and they're having to do all of the things that all the other kids do, but they're also having to, learn all this new music and record it and fly around the country. That's just incredible.
It is.
The amount of work that takes.
It's an insane amount of work. But it really, you can see the ones that are so excited about it, they just dive in, and they're really excited to explore programs and to right away get on the audition rep, and they just dive in. And then others kind of just go cross-eyed and just slowly realize like, okay, this is not, the process itself is too much to even get what they thought they wanted to do. And so it's in that aspect, it's good that it's so rigorous, because it sort of shows them what is required in this area.
Yeah. Wow.
Friends, this concludes the second part of what is a 3-part interview. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, hopefully you enjoyed the first part of my conversation with Lynda Doepker about her recent visit to Loyola University Chicago. We'll now resume the final part of that College Spotlight.
So there's a medical school and a law school. They have about 250 student organizations. So there is always something to do. The student that led the tour, it had come down for her choosing between Howard University and Loyola, and she chose Loyola. She liked the vibe. She liked the city, the programs. She was an environmental studies student, and she felt the programs were great. She was a person of color, and she found her tribe easily. She had just come back the night before. They had an event down at Water Tower campus, and she was talking about, all the music, which I did not know any of.
Showing your age, Lynda.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. If it's pre 1986, I mean that's the music I know. Everything after that, I'm clueless. So anyway, it was good to hear that. Students can declare second majors the second semester of freshman year. Like I mentioned before, everyone has to take it's basically an intro to Loyola class. They do have pre-professional programs for law, medicine, a lot of health sciences programs, occupational therapy, optometry, physical therapy, physician's assistant, and you get special counseling for these as well. So it's great if you're looking at continuing on into one of those programs. Some of the special opportunities that they have, I mentioned the Rome Start. They do have a lot of students who study abroad, probably about 35%. And while they have that Rome campus, you have access to about 150 other programs. Some of those will be led by Loyola faculty, and some they partner with other organizations. They have interdisciplinary programs. They have 5-year programs where you can get your bachelor's and master's within 5 years. And they have a 6-year early admission program for the law school. So 3 years undergraduate, 3 years law, which is terrific. And they have and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, the Arupi College, which is a 2-year college. And it's for low-income students, giving them access to a Loyola education. So if you are low income, especially in Illinois, and you're looking at community colleges, you might take a look at that. Sports. I'm going to tell you what I know, Mark. And they're the Ramblers. Mm-hmm. They're D1, part of the Atlantic 10 Conference. And they have a lot of intramural and club sports. And they do have an indoor rock climbing gym, which looked like a lot of fun. But I didn't get the feeling that this is not, it's not the rah-rah kind of sports mentality that I would think of. Comparing it to Georgia Tech, I feel like Georgia Tech had more of a sports kind of vibe about it than Loyola does.
It's funny because here in Georgia, it's like Georgia just so dominates Georgia Tech
right.
that nobody thinks of Georgia Tech as the rah-rah. But I will say that the basketball team, because I do follow that, they've got a pretty good buzz about them. And of course they've had some success. They had Sister Jean, and they had a lot and they had their big run. And I follow them because Drew Valentine is their coach, who used to be an assistant coach at Michigan State. And also they're in the Atlantic 10 where Davidson is there, and I follow Davidson sports too. So basketball, I think, listen, I'm not comparing it to Michigan State or Indiana or Duke or Connecticut or one of like the powerhouse programs. But for a mid-major, they've had some pretty good success, which I don't know about the rest of their sports. But normally schools have like football, basketball, your marquee. That's where the crowds come out. Occasionally, women's basketball is starting to really catch on right now. So if you're Iowa or UConn or Notre Dame or Stanford, women's basketball has been a draw. And then some places baseball, some places ice hockey. But in general, people aren't coming out for the cross country meets. Even when I was at Michigan State running track, I mean, you were running track and even at the Big Ten championship, we weren't packing the stadiums.
That's funny. Yeah. So I thank you for sharing that about the sports, because that is not, I tend to gloss over the sports kind of thing. For orientation, and I think this is kind of important for new students. They do have summer orientation. They have several dates in June and July. It's just 2 days, and they try and get all the students on campus at least for that time. You meet with your academic advisor, you select classes, you see the dorms, and then you move in a week prior to the start of classes. And that gets you time to kind of get your feet on the ground. They have all kinds of events, and you sign up for those 250 organizations and start to make friends and become a Rambler. For application, they do a holistic review. So they're looking at your transcript. They're looking for rigor. They need a recommendation from a teacher or a counselor. That's required. They do have an option to submit one additional recommendation. Their GPA average is 3.82. And I know how we feel about that because they're all different. So what does that really mean? So that's where they're really looking at the transcript and making sure you have that rigor. But they're not looking for a student that's got all straight A's. Having B's and the occasional C should not preclude you from applying to Loyola. They remain test optional. If you do decide to submit tests, the mid-range for the ACT is 27 to 32. For the SAT, it's 1160 to 1350, and they do super score.
And let me say something for a sec, because I think sometimes numbers can intimidate a little bit. People hear 382 and they think cutoff. Absolutely not. We see lots of kids consistently admitted to Loyola with 3.2s, 3.3s, 3.4s, 3.5s, on a consistent basis. So that might be their weighted GPA. And my sense is that it is their weighted GPA. And that's when it really means nothing, because then you don't even know what weighting system they're using. Even if they're using the most common weighting system, which is 1 full point for an AP or IB and a half a point for honors or advanced, a 382 could be a 3.3 regular, And then the other thing with the testing, 27 to 31, keep in mind, more than half the students in this country did not submit scores for the last few years. So that those averages are built off of the highest,
Exactly.
I don't know at the top of my head what percent submit at Loyola, but let's say 40% submit.
And that's high because it's in the 30 percentile.
There you go.
Where students submitted that. And some of that is skewed to your nursing students. It's going to be more competitive.
Good point. I just don't want people to get intimidated, because this is one of those really, really strong schools with an over 80% admit rate, and so it's a place that can serve a range of students.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. They do not require any additional essays beyond the personal statement. And they don't have early decision or early action. They have rolling admission and priority deadline. Their priority deadline is December 1st. But rolling admission goes up until June.
Lynda, why don't you explain priority deadlines? Not everybody might know that. Most probably do, but we have new listeners all the time.
So especially if you're looking for financial aid and applying for scholarships, when you apply, you are automatically considered for merit scholarships. They do have other competitive scholarships that you'll need to submit applications for, and those are generally by December 1. But if you are, if you're a senior and you're still looking at schools, they are still accepting applications. So that's something to keep in mind.
And let me just keep in mind, schools can be priority admissions for admissions, for financial aid, or for both. So worked with a student this year. In fact, shout out to the mom. I'm not going to mention her name, but she's a regular podcast listener. I like to talk in code where the only person who knows I'm talking about them is the listener. And then they were like, "You were talking about me, weren't you?" And I'm like, "Yeah."
They're so tricky.
But I only make sure it's positive. So, but one of the schools her daughter was looking at was somebody also interested in direct admit for nursing. They had priority deadline. And the statistics that they shared was that their priority admission, it was a priority deadline for admission. If you met the priority deadline, the admit rate was over 80%. If you missed it, it was single digits. So that's more of an extreme than most, but I love to use that as an example when I'm talking to students, because you should see their face. Like, talk about getting the message across to them that, okay, I better get it in. That's why, like, for students Lynda and I work with, our goal is always 80% of your applications turned in by Labor Day and the last 20% in October, because rarely will you see a priority admission date that's before November 1. There are some that have moved into October, but it's rare. And so, as a strategy, if you think I'm gonna get let's say your student's about to be a rising senior, get 80% of the applications done by September, you make the senior year so much more manageable, so much less stressful. And if you can get everything else in by mid-October, then you'll make all the priority deadlines that are out there.
You see me nodding my head, big giant nods, because you're absolutely right. Senior year, there's so much going on. And the last thing you want to be doing right up to deadlines is working on college applications.
So listen, friends, if you're listening, because we give our students a bit of a break at this time, because this is like the heart of AP season. So this is a time to really focus on your APs. But right after those APs are done, those months of the last part of May, June, July, and August, that is prime time for you to get these applications done, to take advantage of priority deadlines and to make the senior year manageable.
Absolutely. So you're going to ask me, who would Loyola be good for?
I am. Fire away.
So I think Loyola is a great place, just like we were talking about, for students who don't have those tippy top grades, but are still strong students. I think it is a good place for students who want to help others, who want to make an impact on their community and on the world, how they can incorporate that service learning in their own lives and their own careers. I think students who are looking for personal growth and want to do some self-reflection, I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. Students who are curious about other people and other cultures and have an open mind and want to learn. I think Loyola is a welcoming place. Most students, I think, could be happy here. There's just such a variety, and you walk in and you feel like you've got a big hug. Students who want beautiful views, it is really stunning views from most of the campus buildings of Lake Michigan. I almost set off an alarm in one of the buildings, because I was like, oh, I'm just going to go out here. And thankfully, someone grabbed me before I set off the alarm, because I was mesmerized by the blue water, even on a cold, cloudy February day.
Lynda likes her views. She recently got back from USF, University of San Francisco, and she's still talking about those views from that campus.
I'm a Midwest girl, and but I have lived, in Florida. I used to be a beach connoisseur. It's been a while for me, but there's a lot to be said for Lake Michigan in the summer. I'll put Lake Michigan views and beaches up against just about anywhere else. So definitely, if a student is looking for that.
There's one other thing I would add, and that is somebody that likes the city, because you get to be in the, I'd say, third or fourth biggest city in the country, because my understanding is Houston's about to pass it. I remember when Chicago was the second biggest city in the country, and then Los Angeles passed it. I'm told Houston is about to push it pretty soon to fourth. But either way, you get to be in one of the absolute biggest cities in the country, and that's going to come with a lot of amenities. Well, all kinds of things that we haven't focused on here because we focused on Loyola. But if you're someone that's really into theater, if you're someone that's really you like professional sports, if all museums, I mean, all of the another thing a lot of our students ask for, Lynda knows this, a lot of our students want to be close to an international airport. They want to be able to get in and get to that campus closely. They don't want to fly in and then it's another 2 hours to get to the campus. For some people, that's really important. And so you're going to get all of the amenities that come with the major city. And what I find a lot of times, if I'm not working with the Midwest family, when they want to be in a city, they tend to think coastally. So the first thing they tend to think of is Boston, Philly, New York, DC, maybe Atlanta, Miami, or Los Angeles, San Francisco. And that tends to be the first thoughts that they have. Well, they're missing an absolute world-class city that I'm got a little sour grapes over here because, the Democratic National Convention came down to Atlanta and Chicago. And everybody thought Atlanta was going to win. Even the people in Chicago thought that Atlanta was going to win. But Governor Pritzker, the billionaire governor, said he'll pay for every single penny of the expenses. And I'm sure there were other factors as well. But we learned recently that Chicago beat out Atlanta. And yes, Dave's over there flexing. He's over there flexing. I got a little sour grapes. But no, that's another thing that I would add, that we have a lot of people that are like fish. They're like, they'd be like fish outside of water if they're not in a city. It's really important to them. And it's a high priority for them in their college search that they want to be in a city. And that's going to be something you're going to get with a Loyola.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because they do take advantage of the city, and which brings me to the honors college or honors program, which I didn't mention. So they do have an honors program for students. It's by invitation only. And the reason why I bring that up is they were talking about, they were getting ready to go to the Art Institute of Chicago, all of the honors students. So they definitely take advantage of that. One of the big things that city provides is internships. They have a requirement for experiential learning, and that can look different depending on your major. So if you're a nursing major, it's going to be your clinicals take care of that. If you're a communications major, that may be, producing a radio program, but they have internships and research opportunities that are tough to find anywhere else. And they're right there, within 15 minutes of your dorm room. So they definitely take advantage of the city in that way.
Lynda, this has been awesome. And you're not going to believe this. I don't even have a single question. So don't have a heart attack. Don't faint. So you actually answered any question that I would have. I really think this is amazing. Strongly encourage you to, if you're interested in Chicago at all, or if you like cities, or if you like Jesuit schools, this is one we encourage your student to research. And obviously, as residents of Chicago, both Dave and Lisa have been on this campus quite a bit, and now you've been here. And so I'm excited to get there. It's either going to be the 10th, 11th, or 12th. I'm staying with Dave from the 9th through the 13th. And I'm going to hit college visits up in the day and then hang out with him in the night. So I'm going to do Loyola and get back to some places I've been in the past, which are Chicago, DePaul, and Northwestern. And I'm seeing if I can squeeze the University of Illinois, Chicago there, but I definitely need to get to Loyola. So thank you for this, Lynda. This has been great.
My pleasure. Thanks, Mark.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
Friends, on Monday's episode, I'm going to turn the corner away from reflections on the class of 2023 and talk about something that has been percolating in my mind for a while. And Julie and I met this week to discuss it, and it kind of really reinforced my thinking. And it has to do with a new approach to college admissions tours. So I'm going to share that with you. You're kind of getting my thoughts as I reflect and think through an important topic. And then, of course, we'll continue the final part with Lynda Doepker and Lisa, just both reflecting on their experience of what it was like for their students to transition from high school to college. So we hope you'll join us Monday for episode 324. But I can't leave you without this thought, especially as students just get through National Candidate Reply Day, ink the decision, make those deposits, make those commitments to their schools. That's just the starting point. That's not the arrival getting into college. It's the starting point, because it's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's what you do when you get there and what you do when you get out of there. See you on Monday, friends.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Lynda Doepker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Lynda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.